I want to now transition over to our next topic because Chris, you were talking to me about how WoW Classic is getting a hardcore mode, or like and something like that. So why don't you break that down? What does that mean?
So hardcore has existed in games for a long time. The idea that death is permanent. There are a lot of games out there that make dying part of it. There are even games like Dwarf Fortress where dying is fun becomes a slogan of the game. But there is an element of, like, once people get so good at a game that can add replayability to watching hardcore runs, or even progressing to the point that you see no hit runs in some games where you never get struck by an enemy the entire clear, becomes part of adding that challenge and adding that mastery to it, where the game just didn't have a difficulty high enough to satisfy those players. MMOs have not historically been something that have had a large kind of hardcore basis, as opposed to something like ARPGs or something. But here we are. And so the World of Warcraft community has been, like, it's been ever present for a long time, but in recent months, it has blown up, where there is an entire community surrounding this. So now we're moving into massively multiplayer RPGs instead of just standard RPGs like Pokemon. Pokemon's a great example of kind of what do you do if a Pokemon faints? Like, do you have to let it go? And so, or like different restrictions on how many pets you can catch per zone and things like that to just add difficulty. So this community's kind of popped up, and they've added all sorts of different variations on it. So there's just, if you die, you restart and that's it. But then there's also restrictions on, you can't interact with the auction house, or you can't party with other players, or whatever the restriction may be. And that just adds more and more layers to hardcore. The devs of Classic have now come out, and one of them has said that World of Warcraft is interested in bringing hardcore Classic servers online. Their initial phrasing is basically like, all those variations make it way too muddy. They love that that's community driven. So what they'd like to do instead is they just want to add the base rule in that if you die, your character's done. You'll come back as a ghost, so that you don't have to delete your character in case, like, your character's like the leader of a guild or something. Like, that creates a lot of weird social dynamics if the character just gets deleted automatically. So you can come back as a ghost, but you can't ever resurrect. That's it. You're done. It's been really addicting to watch. I've been watching people do high-end max level raiding in Classic in groups that are all hardcore players, which is just really intriguing to watch people doing Molten Core, and then, like, a priest goes down in a boss fight in a group of 40, and afterwards everybody's like, oh my gosh, because that person lost days and days and days of progress. They probably lost 14 days of playtime or something on that character, or something silly, which would just be painful to watch that go away. So it's exciting. This is in addition to them bringing out some other variation of Classic. They know they don't want to call it Season of Mastery, but for now I don't have like a better stand-in name. But ideally, there's been some speculation. What if they had Classic progress beyond Classic without going into Burning Crusade? What if they came back and added different variations to things? What if they made small changes to the game and kind of, breathed life into it the same way you would see an action RPG breathe life into a season, where there's a reason to play because it's a little bit different this time. This is where you get, like, possibly more of an ongoing community, something like old school RuneScape, where the community kind of votes on what they want to change, or you get something like a Diablo style game or Path of Exiles that the devs have an idea of a flavor for the season, and each season the community kind of gives feedback on how well that flavor was received. Either way, it's exciting to see that be the case, because that's something that I think, in a world where it feels like the movies have just stopped coming out with new ideas some months and are just going to only just re-release old ideas. This says, like, re-releasing old ideas doesn't mean the end of creativity. It doesn't mean the death of creativity. You can still have something that breathes this back. And so for many of us that have seen them, all these remakes, remasters, reforges, relaunches, whatever you want to call them, just upping the graphics isn't enough. So I don't know that it needs to be as transformative as Final Fantasy VII, but it would be nice as you start to go back, as you talk about these pixel remasters, the ability to kind of scale that difficulty. Yeah, that's kind of cool. Like, as we we're right now, everybody's talking about Zelda. How many people do you think have beaten the original Zelda that came out in, like, the late 80s?
I have no idea.
I've beaten it.
I beat it
half a dozen times or more.
Yeah.
But re-releasing that in an interesting way beyond just a pixel remaster, how would that be received?
I think in terms of game preservation, that would be amazing. In that regards, that you have that as an option. You can still play the original difficulty, or you can, as a player now, can change it up, and it just gives you those kind of options. I appreciate that the pixel remasters have done that for me for this collection, but also have taken it with the 16:9 view, like how they really put that love and care into it. It really kind of, I think, shows, and I'm so glad that Square Enix has taken the time to do that. And I think the ultimate would have been them putting it into the 2D HD Octopath Traveler style engine, because I'd love to see like that level of visual fidelity brought to these games. But now that we have that as kind of a preservation, I think that hopefully gives them more license to do more things like that. Now, back to the ultra hard mode for PvP. So the question is how does that work in with PvP? Like, are these PvP servers, like, are you running around and, hey, we're all flagged for PvP, I got no choice, now I'm dead? Is that the case?
So there's definitely the ability to grief other players. There's definitely all sorts of mechanics that they're going to have to address, as far as like what happens if somebody's dragging monsters into somebody and then feigning death so it attacks them. But already out of the gate, you can tell they're starting to address that, because one of the things you can do with another player is you can duel them, and you just go till one player hits one life. But they are adding something called duel to the death, which I think is really exciting and really high stakes. So I cannot imagine what happens if you have people, if they can line up tournaments or something where you have 40 people enter and only one is going to come out the other side. What does that look like? That starts to take, because the PvP grind back in the day was really epic because none of us knew what we were doing. Mm-hmm. But what it became is when Classic launched, it turned out that people could optimize the fun out of anything. And so I think this would add a lot of that back, to see a grand marshal or something on a server, and they're a grand marshal of like the gladiators. And so I think there's some really exciting things they can add as they kind of explore things like duel to the death. There absolutely is the ability to kill other players in the wild, whether you're on PvP server or not. So that is something that I think is part of it. You also have like what happens if there's a disconnect. So it's not going to be for everybody. It's the same thing as a deep dungeon. Like, there are some people that just cannot handle the idea of like, well, what if I disconnect on floor 77? Then you disconnect on floor 77. Like, I don't. Right. It feels like you answered your own question. Like, we all feel bad and it sucks, but there's not a solution. Like, that's the nature of this. So it's not going to be the majority of the player population. I think that's why it's important that they say this is in addition to another mode. It's not the other mode.
It's not the other mode. Yeah.
We would like to do both of these things because we think it'll be really exciting to watch. It would be like adding, like there's been some people that have called for like the world first race to take place on its own server. To just take the top 10 or 100 teams or whatever and just go put them on their own server. And I think that, it would change the race, like just kind of thinking that through. So this is kind of saying that it's like, what if we just let the hardcore players do that on their own hardcore server? Because when I watch some of these videos that are griefing, what's really frustrating right now is hardcore is a mode you opt into with an add-on and things like that. But the people that grief you, they don't have to be hardcore. So if you kill them, they can just come back. As opposed to on a hardcore server, I will say, while people can grief, if they mess up, their character's deleted. So the idea that some level 40